All right, guys. Well, welcome to the very first episode of the Pens and Poison podcast. You've seen the poems on YouTube, you've seen the daily literary bites on Instagram, but you haven't seen anything like this yet, where we discuss not just books and literature, but the state of the world as it relates to the humanities as a whole. I'm your host, Liza, and we have an amazing line of guest speakers lined up, from writers to publishing professionals to just witty individuals. So hit that subscribe button because you definitely don't want to miss out. For our very first episode, I thought it would be fun to generate some controversy and hear some hot takes from a voice you typically don't hear much from in the literary and the arts world. We'll be interviewing a self-described conservative to hear what he has to say about literature and the humanities. Today, we'll be talking about why writers and artists in general tend to skew politically left and why many folks in the modern world have lost an appreciation for reading, literature, and the humanities as a whole. To answer some of these burning questions, I have a dear friend of mine with me, Yan Margolin, who recently rose to Twitter and YouTube fame on Nick Shirley's channel for his sharp commentary on the ongoing situation in the Middle East and on college campuses. I'll link the video down below so you guys can check it out as well. Professionally, Jan's also a seasoned lawyer who runs his own practice. So if you ever got yourself in trouble, Jan's your guy. Jan, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. You and I obviously are very close friends to begin with. So I guess while I have my 12 seconds of fame, whatever it is, I suppose we'll use it to the best we can, see where it takes us.
Now, Jan and I may actually see eye to eye on many issues, but we've historically somewhat disagreed on the importance of the arts and literature. So today we're going to fight it out, or maybe come to a mutual consensus as we discuss the decline of the humanities. Now, it's no secret that the humanities have been on the decline. I work as a college consulting professional, and it's maybe 1 in 10, or if not 1 in 20 students these days who are opting to study the humanities in favor of social science or STEM. So Jan, my first question to you, and by the way, Jan holds a humanities degree himself in history from NYU.
Sure, NYU.
Aside from the obvious answer of the humanities aren't lucrative, though you can touch on that as well if you want, why do you think fewer and fewer people are studying literature and the humanities?
Okay, so first of all, I'm sure some of you heard that Tucker Carlson interviewed Putin a while ago. From what I understand, it was a somewhat wasteful interview, but a great meme was born from that, where he was asked a question about, like, why do you belong in Ukraine? And he's like, well, it goes back to 14th century, where instead of answering the question, you begin, like, way back, and by the time you get to the answer, like, no one even really remembers what the question was, because you've completely enthralled them. If your girlfriend asks you, why did you come home at 4 a.m. last night? Like, well, you see, it begins in 1972. And by the time you get to the answer, again, she doesn't even remember why she's angry, because she's just so confused. So I think to really explain this phenomenon and to understand it, we should first go back to what it was to be in the humanities and how this field of study began, right? We're talking about early, probably 19th century, England, Europe. We're talking about the cream of the crop of the most wealthy and plutocratic, often if it's in England. So someone whose father worked for, like, the British shipping company or the Royal Shipping Company, whatever. We're looking at a place where young men, to say that they're white would be an understatement. This is a time when Italians weren't considered white. So needless to say, we're talking about very waspy people. All men going to these schools to basically be seasoned. They weren't going to work in history, or they weren't going to use history for a living. They were studying Socrates and Plato and Robespierre, perhaps, though probably less so, and then end up working for their father, shipping millions of tons of tea somewhere, right? So that was the initial understanding. Our current system where people study these things and that is what they spend all this money on to learn is obviously new, very new. And that leads us to an interesting position where it used to be built for people who were studying this to gain sort of a Renaissance man angle, but then that wouldn't be what they would do. That would just prep them for gentlemanly society, right? And then at some point, more humanities began to be practiced, things like history or philosophy that maybe prepared people for a more intellectual way of thinking, an easier way of reading. It was the best way to learn to be philosophical. It was a continuation of what you would maybe study in in high school, that would take you further and allow you to become maybe a lawyer or maybe an accountant or something like this. And back then, the humanities were even then, a relatively limited area of study. Anthropology, history, things like this. I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a stream of commercials, and one of them was making fun of Real Men of Genius. I think it was a beer commercial. And they were making fun of people like baristas, right? Why does a latte cost so much? Why does it take so long to make? And the joke was, if you get a history degree, there's two things you can do. Get a nose ring and pour coffee, or go to law school, right? So it became this, it still had this relevancy as sort of a preparatory place, right? These days, you can learn quite a bit on the internet. So many utterly unbelievable elements and majors have been introduced into liberal arts. No longer does liberal arts simply mean history or anthropology. Now we're talking about Pan-African transgender studies, space communism, I'm sure is one, for instance. So we're talking about things where they are just an outright extraction of money from students, and often their parents, or the government, or some sort of institution that lends money to them, hoping to get money from the government. So in many ways, it's become kind of a cycle of this kind of production. But that obviously answers part of your question. I think another part is, well, what you said in your preamble, how did we get to be so progressive in academia? Did I answer any of your questions, or did I just make one up of my own and answer that one?
No, you're doing well. Let's keep going.
Okay. So let's talk about academia. Now, obviously, the ancient joke, and we're going to try to not harp on this too much, but we have to just acknowledge the elephant in the room when one discusses academics, which is the old saying that those who can do and those who can't teach. That one's always been a hard one to ford, right? Because in many fields there are so many more lucrative and also more powerful things someone can do often than simply be a teacher of others. Obviously, professors can write and have a lot of influence, but the top kid in the med school class is not going to teach in med school. He's going to become a surgeon and drive a car without a roof, right? And probably have 3 more like it in his garage. So that's not necessarily shocking. But that's only part of it, I think. I think that there's such a substantial entrance in our academia of, obviously, first of all, it goes without saying that academics are going to be more, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Not just philosophical, but idealistic and idyllic in their worldview, perhaps somewhat less tethered to reality. A perfect example is the Bolshevik Party, right? In the late 19th century, most Russian anarchists, because most Russians were either peasants or aristocrats, either tied to the system or not educated enough to even have a chance of fighting the system. The only exception were really certain middle-class people, particularly Jews, who were very interested, and obviously Lisa and I are both Jewish, so I speak from first-hand knowledge, who were very interested and certainly educated and smart enough to appreciate these more esoteric theories, including Marxism. It was only when they actually got to power they realized that this system is actually quite brutal, and the people that rise to power are basically gangsters. That's why Trotsky maybe won the Civil War and was ousted by the mid-20s and had an ice pick jammed into his head 10 years later, or whatever it was, right? He didn't have what it takes to compete. The same situation. These types of things attract intellectuals. It's unfortunate. It is what it is. I think that's a lot of it. I think, unfortunately, it's sad to say, and it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but isn't. The Soviet Union, when it realized it could not beat America with pure economics, seeded a lot of, I believe it was Yuri Bezmenov, who was sort of came with this idea, let's seed very progressive, anti-American. If we can't beat America from the outside, let's make America hate itself, right? And so during the 60s, there was a giant rise of extreme liberal ideology. And I don't really mean liberal. I mean hyper-progressive or downright statist communist in academia. And unfortunately, because academia is not quite like law or medicine, where it's incredibly competitive based on natural competition. It's based on selection within your own group. So if you're the best academic because other academics think you're the best, it creates very easy cycles of self-selection and self-purification to where you get to a point where it's only those that agree with the heterodoxy of what's being said that actually make it anywhere. That was a lot. Was that too
So
much? That was a lot.
that was good. That
Oh,
was
good,
good.
good.
So what you're saying is that a lot fewer people are going into academia or studying literature in general because they feel that they wouldn't be taken into the academy, or maybe they feel as if the academy doesn't agree with their views because it's that self-selection bias.
No question. I mean, you're having it's all of those things. It's the self-selection bias of people who don't want to be bullied into a far progressive corner. It's the fact that a lot of people who are not so much progressive would be more likely to go into a field that is maybe more lucrative, particularly as it appears as if just, unfortunately, the college degree has become profaned, right? It used to be a massive achievement. Now janitors have college degrees. It's not really anything, right? So as a result, like the risk reward of going into such a philosophical venture, plus the fact that they're just college is for everyone. It's not just the children of the rich who can afford to study something intellectual because they have another position waiting for them in their father's company or what have you. So I think there's a lot of those things going on. Plus the brutal self-selection. Could you imagine being a conservative academic? I mean, I'd have a better chance of wearing a kippah and walking through Rafa.
Sure. Let's break it down for our listeners here. What do you see, or what do you perceive currently happening in the academy that is maybe dissuading people from studying the humanities?
I first of all, I have to admit, when I read that statistic you read me, I have to admit, somewhat pleasantly surprised, because when I go outside and I see the panoply of freakish individuals at these rallies and these protests, I think, my God, each of these people is studying the aforementioned space communism that we were mentioning. So I'm both saddened because I did it myself, and also somewhat emboldened because I'm at least thankful that not everyone is just being fed into this propaganda machine. But I just think, unfortunately, they're also probably, we're dealing with people, when you say going into the humanities, you have to remember that these are 18-year-old kids making a decision of where to go, right? So they're very young, but they're also like really influenced by the most recent of outcomes. Could it be that they've seen their older brothers or just their friends' older brothers and sisters who were the hyperliberals, who were the millennials, who are still living with their parents, who got the history degree or the anthropology degree, and are accomplishing nothing with their life? There's that old meme, right, where it's like the first pane is like a mom and dad conservative buttoned up, and the kid has like tattoos and piercings. He's like, "Mom, screw you! I'm becoming gay and studying, literature." And then the next one is like his parents are like covered in tattoos with piercings, and he goes, "Screw you, mom and dad! I'm studying finance and becoming a Republican." Right? Like it all flips. And if they perceived the older half generation getting these degrees and accomplishing nothing with them, maybe they're smarter than we gave them credit for. Maybe they're seeing, well, I don't need this, right? Maybe I'm just better off going into STEM.
Interesting. So, do you see any objective value in obtaining a degree in literature or English or some humanities field?
Oh yes, of course. I mean, look, even I would admit that I'm a product. My ability to speak and to read is a product of my humanities education. I don't think I had a single number shown to me my entire 4 years at NYU. It was just words in a certain artistic order. I took German literature, or, Renaissance studies. I was hardly studying physics. I promise you that. There is a tremendous amount. The problem is that, let's be honest, even what we would laugh at and say were the soft sciences 20 years ago are now the more useful or hard versions of liberal arts. It's what I mentioned before. Literature is one thing. How many people are going to college, even the great colleges at Columbia, and studying literature versus the aforementioned like Pan-Asian African wasn't there that one extraordinarily unpleasant looking girl who was heading up the Columbia protest with the keffiyeh, the Jewish girl with the keffiyeh? How great! And wasn't she? Didn't they release her like thesis, her senior thesis, and it was something about like it involved boats, Marxism, and like the 19th century. And I couldn't even because it was so pathetically obviously repetitive that like I couldn't even keep reading, right? But that, right? So isn't that kind of a concern that that's becoming liberal arts? It's not even literature anymore.
So you're drawing a distinction between, let's say, something like a philosophy or a history or a literature, and then these sorts of studies degrees that are maybe gender studies or African American studies or underwater
We'll
basket
call them
weaving.
goblin studies as sort of a catch-all term, I think.
All right, so Goblin studies versus kind of the traditional humanities. So you do see a value in terms of, studying literature, right? So for the listeners of this channel, a lot of them are interested in literature. So what would you say is the objective value of studying literature, for instance?
Well, I mean, if you want to talk about from a more useful perspective, and again, I'm assuming those listening here are not Vanderbilts or Rockefellers. They do not have a oil empire that they will inherit with their literature degree, right? So to those, I would say that it is a great, remember, you need a college degree for almost any advanced study, right? So whether you want to become a psychologist or whether you want to become a lawyer, certainly a lawyer. And I'm sure there are probably a few other degrees I can think of that are not purely scientific, but are worthwhile master's or PhD or doctorate level studies, JD being a doctorate, surprisingly. Um, for those people, you're being taught to read and to write at a very high level. Now, of course, the downside is there's also the concern of, well, who are your professors going to be? Are you going to go to school where you're going to be demanded to basically write what they want to hear, how they want to hear it all the time? And are you going to learn from people qualified to teach you, or were they hired for their political views? So that's obviously also a concern. But yes, there is. Though, of course, I'd reverberate the question upon you, and I'll put you in the seat, and I'll ask, well, what does one do with those degrees if not law school?
Well, I did something very unique and interesting.
You don't count. You're a one in a million example because you were able to spin five different talents you had into one thing that yielded you a very successful career. But I would not, much like my own law practice, which is based on my own bizarre personality and unusual suite of talents, I would not recommend someone follow my path. So I don't think yours is really replicable quite so easily.
Sure. And I would venture to agree with Jan that maybe the English degree or the history degree in itself is not valuable from a money earning perspective. However, I do think that the humanities have a lot to teach us, especially kind of, once again, not goblin studies, but these classical fields that have, scholars have been studying for many centuries. English, history, philosophy. I do think that they teach us how to go about the world, how to look at the world in a more interesting light. And I think, studying a book or a poem gives us a different perspective on the world and tells us a little bit about human nature and how to interact with the people around us.
I had a thought as you were speaking, and it kind of just
Sure.
occurred to me. I know that college nowadays is about drinking and partying and occasionally changing your gender. But by and large, college used to be, and call me crazy, about actually working hard and learning things, right? So there's nothing stopping someone from doing more than one thing. Instead of all those aforementioned debaucherous activities, one could simply do pre-med and also take a co-major or a minor in literature, because this will be their last chance to read in such an esoteric and philosophical and imperial sense before they return to the empirical. So, while I would caution someone to be purely a humanities major, unless there's someone for whom a career is not their main drive, I would strongly, in the strongest possible terms, advise that everyone take at least one course such as this, if not more, at their university, no matter what they're studying.
Sure. What would you say was the most memorable course you took in college?
There are a few. So there was one. I had a wonderful professor. He was in the Italian and history department. It was like I believe we were studying films during the fascist era, even, or maybe like before then and through then, and how it reflected like Italy's zeitgeist and sort of what was going on in politics. That was fascinating. I think I took a course in the Medicis. That was a lot of fun. I remember I took a course on World War II with a very liberal professor, and I think he actually brought me into his office around in, I would say, probably a month before the end of the class in the semester. And back then, I didn't look quite like this. I was just a fat kid. I'm still fat now, but I have muscle on top of it. But back then, I was still very aggressive, and I was very forceful. He said to me, Jan, the other children, you know a lot, and you say so much, and they just can't handle it. So he basically made me a deal that he would give me an A minus if I just never spoke again. I took the deal, and then I think I spoke anyway. I just kept saying, I don't know how it happened. I got the A minus, so I guess that worked out. But so those are memorable classes. I mean, NYU back then was actually pretty good, and the classes were interesting. I learned a lot of esoteric things and interesting philosophies, interesting history. I remember Professor Elihu Rose. I assume he's not with us anymore, but he was his famous World War II historian, and I think he was there when the Israelis executed Adolf Eichmann, which I'm sure for the modern far-left protester, that was scandalous. They oppressed him by killing that Nazi. So, that's that. They were colonists, So, NYU back then NYU was a wonderful place. What it is now, I shudder to think.
So you seem to be intimating here that part of the decline of the humanities has happened because, to put it bluntly, a bunch of liberals have taken over the humanities. Let's talk a little bit more about that and this perceived accusation of liberals taking over humanities. Why do you think that is? And for our listeners who disagree with that statement, what is the strongest evidence that you can provide that is the case?
Well, it's been very liberal for a long time. It's not that it's liberal. It's that it's uber progressive and very heterodoxical with opinions. The best example is the fact that Jordan Peterson's one of the best known academics on the planet, and he was fired from his university. He was fired. Could you imagine the kind of geniuses that continue to work there? I can't. I'd rather not, in fact. So there's that. As far as the evidence for it, I mean, one, it's the proliferation of the type of Goblin studies, as we refer to them, that are now available and celebrated instead of mocked. In the old days, those studies existed only for, like, football players who were like, I believe a famous USC football player was studying basket weaving and ballroom dancing while, being the quarterback of USC. So that's a part of it. We see with the fact that many of these professors are joining in these protests. What does that say? Professors are joining with basically terrorism supporters who are celebrating just because these people, they perceive them as being browner and therefore right, no matter what, they're celebrating Islamism, right? That's not a great sign. That would not have happened 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. Certainly any polling of any academics has shown that they're extremely liberal, extraordinarily so. I don't know if that's maybe true in STEM so much. I would imagine they're just apolitical. I mean, I'm sure if you went to the Stern School of Business, it wouldn't be quite so stark. But even then, maybe they've chased out those that disagree. The thing about it's the paradox of tolerance. Their intolerance of our intolerance is intolerable. So there is really no room for disagreement in these circles.
Right. Well, you're right. The Stern School of Business has Jonathan Haidt, who we talked about the other day, who runs the Heterodox Academy. So there are still some really great academics left who do not lean, very, very far left or are self-described leftists. But, we seem to be coming to the conclusion that a lot of academics are leftists and do describe themselves as leftist. Why do you think writers and academics and people in the arts generally tend to skew left?
They didn't used to 150 years ago, but they are all romantics, right? They all believe in a world that is not the present world, but a different world. They also live in a world where brutal outcomes, Darwinism, if you will, does not particularly apply. It's not a world where the best brief or the most accurate surgery or the most, accurate sniper shot, for that matter, matters, right? It's the approval of your peers how esoteric you are. Look at some modern art. These are things that, from any objective perspective, is terrible. But because their peers like it, and because their peers think it's something special, these people advance, right? So similarly, it's no surprise that you take a very esoteric and very dreamy environment or practice, combine it with a self-dealing level of grading, where you must impress those that agree with you on non-empirical evidence-based outcomes. It's probably not shocking that it re-fortifies its own, and I make the mistake, I kept saying heterodoxy. I guess it's not heterodoxy, it's homodoxy? Orthodoxy? What's the phrase for only one view? It can't be homodoxy, that sounds weird.
It's not homodoxy.
It can't be, that's not right.
Oh gosh, you've rendered me speechless.
I have that effect.
Reinforcing their own view.
Whatever, the non-heterodoxy. They're certainly non-heterodoxic, right? So you end up with this situation. And then you throw in the fact that these are people who didn't care much about money. Now, many of them care about money now because they're getting free student loan money and kids are paying $70,000 a year to go to college. But by and large, these are not economy-driven people. These are often influence-driven people. Plus, people on the left tend to be very, very attuned to the need to control thought and control language rather than controlling actions. So it's no surprise that these kinds of people go into these fields where they then feel the need to teach others like themselves. Those students become the next generation professors, and it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling cycle.
Sure.
I should rotate my hands in from the camera. It's not really helpful.
On the flip side, obviously, maybe we can make the argument that a lot of people on the left are much too inundated in this whole, as you said, idealistic discourse in this, dreamy world and whatnot. But on the flip side, we're maybe seeing fewer and fewer conservatives go in and, interact with art or read books or see the value of literature. So don't you think it's worthwhile for more conservatives to spend time with such things?
They are, but at the expense of undermining your whole premise. They should probably do that in the privacy of their home, right? Because there's beauty in all the things you're talking about, be it something as crass as Chaucer, or something as advanced as really any historical novel.
You call Chaucer crass?
He's very crass, right?
He is, but that's not the first word I would think
Scandalous?
of.
Debaucherous?
Scandalous in the Middle Ages, sure.
I think it was pretty scandalous now.
Yeah.
What I remember.
You're thinking of Boccaccio. I think he's a little worse.
Maybe I am. Maybe I made this together.
Boccaccio, he's the one with
but if I recall correctly, they're both like somewhat sex and toilet humor. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, you're right.
There were toilet humor when people didn't have toilets. So there you go.
It's true.
What does that say? So that's just outdoor humor. But you would think they'd be German with that sort of sub theme. But the problem is, think about how unwelcome those conservative students would be. First of all, you're talking about people who are 18 to 22. Most people are not that confrontational. If they're met with that kind of oppositionism, they're just going to leave and go somewhere else. I'm the one who runs face first into the fire, and I'm the one who draws pleasure from causing chaos and being in chaos. Most people are normal. They're not like this. So most people are not, if you ask a conservative 20-year-old why he's not taking a philosophy class with someone who goes by Gégère with purple hair and who's like talking about the racism of Julius Caesar or something, do you really need to ask?
So what was it like for you being a conservative in the humanities at NYU?
We have to remember I'm over 3,000 years old. So when I went to college, the trees were still talking to the people. It was very druidic in that sense. No, when I went to college, it was different. It was a given that it was liberal. I think George Bush had been reelected around then. So, you had some crazies about that. But looking back on that now, compared to today, college was apolitical. Like, if you look from an Overton window lens, apolitical. And,
Sure.
The professor's obviously more liberal, but the idea of, like, having to siphon everything through the lens of perceived racism or perceived colonialism was just it was just ridiculous. It just wasn't done.
So in the study of literature, we have, I guess, different schools of thought through which we can analyze a novel or a poem, and a lot of these schools of thought are actually informed by kind of leftist views. And I actually did a video on this where I talked about kind of the different philosophical books or some philosophy books that
It's hard for the listeners to believe that Liza's capable of. If this is the first time they hear her speak, they would think she's a mute. That's just because I'm here. I just don't stop. She's actually quite loquacious, I promise.
It's okay. They've heard me talk before. He likes to talk a lot. But anyway, to go back to what I was saying, the study of the literary arts, or these kind of schools of literary thought, are informed by a lot of these kind of leftist political books, I guess you can say. And it's interesting because there was actually a lot of conservative thought that was also being produced around that time in the 20th century when these, big schools of thought were coming to fruition, so to speak. So we had the sort of post-colonialist way of analyzing literature, and we had...
When you say post-colonialist, what era are you referring to?
We got Edward Said. Said?
That doesn't sound promising. Just based on the last name.
Edward Said, so he was a Palestinian scholar. He was actually a professor at Columbia University.
Jordanian is what you mean. Interesting.
Oh my god. Don't mind him. So Edward Said, he was a scholar at Columbia University. He, created this school of post-colonialist thought, and it's actually one of the kind of predominant schools of literary thought right now. So he has a book called Orientalism, and we've derived a large part of this kind of Orientalist school of thought from Edward Said's book, Orientalism. And he's not very happy about it. And so there is an argument that a lot of the study of literature has been framed by kind of leftist...
I think the word looking for is prism. It's through which prism does the light refract, right? Yes. And it's the prism, the lens of this particular grasp of madness, right?
Sure. So, and whether you decide to call it madness or not, that is just kind of how the study of literature evolved throughout the 20th century. You also have, obviously, Marxism as a really, really big school of thought. You also have the neo-Marxists who came in. So, for instance, Adorno and Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School. Do you happen to know Herbert?
I know about the Frankfurt School. Let me tell you something.
He's into it. Herbert Marcuse.
Was the Frankfurt School in the 30s? Or was that later?
They were a little bit later. So they were post World War II. One of their biggest books, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, by these two guys named Adorno and Horkheimer, and a big part of kind of neo-Marxist literary thought was influenced by this philosophy book.
It sounds like at least they weren't Jewish. I'm already embarrassed enough that Marx was, not to mention Trotsky. So I'm just glad to see that there are, subversives that are not of my background. Thank God.
Well, I'm going to look this up.
Oh no! Please say don't burst my bubble.
The whole thing was they were basically trying to explain why the Holocaust happened and why fascism arose, and so it was actually less about the Marxism. There's obviously a lot of Marxism in there, but it's less about why the fascism arose. It's less about why neo-Marxism is great, and more about why the whole kind of fascist authoritarian.
Well, it's very ironic because the two movements are deeply tied together. They're both products of the Romantic era of the late 19th century. The difference is one of them romanticizes class and the other romanticizes race, but both, or nation in the case of Mussolini, but both are actually quite similar in a lot of different respects and heavily anti-individualistic. But they don't
I have some news for you, Yan. Adorno's father was Jewish, so...
Damn it!
There you go.
Damn it! I knew it was too good to be true.
I like it. I actually like Adorno. He's shaking his head. He's shaking his head. Adorno's very cool. I have a poem based on this book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment.
At least we know Stalin wasn't Jewish. That's 100% certain. We can start there. We can work backwards. Okay,
don't mind him. Adorno, he has a very cool explanation for fascism, and he basically says that it's because we went into the Enlightenment too seriously, and when you kind of have a very strict order for everything, that is naturally going to devolve into fascism. So, and of course, it happened to the Germans because the Germans have a very strict order for everything, and that's basically his argument. So it's actually a little bit less.
I mean, not to go way off the rails, but the one thing I learned in history, and one of my fascinating kind of theories is Nazi Germany cannot be perceived alone. It's really the rise and fall of Prussianism, right? Because again, I'm going to do the same thing I do where I begin like 1,000 years earlier, but Germany was, as you may know, was one of the last countries to unify as a state, right? Germany, as we knew it, was a mix of two things. Up until 1860, it was a mix of Austria-Hungary, where a German minority governed a very quilt-like tapestry of states, and then it was various principalities and city-states, of which Brandenburg Prussia became Germany, right? But basically, the leadership of Brandenburg, before the French Revolution, everything was nation-state, but with a king. It wasn't belief in your own people, it was belief in the hierarchy that you were part of. It wasn't nationalism. French created nationalism, and part in the same way following the American model, right? The American Revolution began kind of the big changes in Europe, but the French Revolution took, what is it, like liberté, fraternité, and something else.
Égalité.
Exactly, right? The idea of nationalism with liberty, with individualism, the American model, right? And the Prussian and Bismarck and the Prussians, the leadership said, we're looking at our own people who are very hierarchical and very militaristic. What if we took the nationalism, threw out the individualist part, and inserted a sort of statism, a love of thinking for the blood of your nation? I believe his name was Ryan Chapman. He's a wonderful, I think fairly moderate history and philosophy critic who teaches these things. And he defined fascism as thinking with the blood of your nation. Right? Now, obviously, Nazism was the final metastasis of that movement because Mussolini wanted to mix northern, whiter Italians with southern, darker Italians, right? Because the north, they're almost like Austrian, and in the south, they're like, how you doing, Italians, right? You want to mix them together. Hitler obviously had a very different perspective on race and nation, but that was just the final step of that. I think trying to look at it through a very complex lens like that does a disservice. The reality is, it's a very militaristic country that started a bunch of wars. They started like 5 wars in 80 years. There's no way to spin that, you know? So they invaded, at some point they invaded, people don't know this, I think in 1870, they basically occupied Paris and made the French change governments.
So you disagree with
the French for a while, but also like, it's a lot of wars in a short period of time for Germany.
So you disagree with Adorno and Horkheimer's assessment that fascism arose from the Enlightenment?
Well, I don't know if I would oppose that. I mean, I suppose if everyone was still a peasant, then yes. You could also argue that the Industrial Revolution caused fascism, because it would be much harder to invade Russia if your weapons were made of wood or whatever. So yeah, sure. I guess.
Sure.
Right? I mean,
well. So the other thing that I guess Adorno and Horkheimer say that's a little bit more relevant to the study of literature and the arts. So they have this idea called the culture industry, where they essentially, you could think of Adorno as an elitist Marxist, which is actually why a lot of people on the left don't like him that much.
What is it with people on the far left and eating each other? The Jacobins. I mean, everyone's a Jacobin. They're just beheading each other left and right. More left, I guess, but
so he's a little bit elitist, and he says basically that this culture industry is producing the same kind of movie or song over and over again, and it's kind of the same rote production, and we should return to this more primordial state of literary production. And
what's the meme? What is it, like? Abandon society, reject society, embrace monkey. Right? Without the Y?
Well, the way that he purports that we return to high literature or high art is through embracing Marxism. So that's actually where
Does someone like this have any idea that the average author was in the top 1% of the population economically? Like, does he realize this? Does he believe that, like, literature is written by the working class? The working class couldn't read till 100 years ago. And it didn't even exist 50 years before Marx's life began. It didn't even exist.
Well, the argument in the dialectic of enlightenment is more so that we have this capitalist state where people need to work kind of 24/7, and then by the time you get home, you don't want to engage in sort of high art. You just want to engage in a Marvel movie and then relax and really not think about anything.
In a Marxist country?
What's up?
Did this individual ever live in a communist country? He didn't, did he? Not so much.
No,
No,
he didn't.
no,
But,
I did. Wasn't great.
But so what do you think about the argument that people work too much, and then because they're so overworked, they no longer have the capacity to consume high art?
Other than capitalism,
consume is a bad word choice there, but go
other
ahead.
than capitalism in the post-war era, I can't think of a time people have worked less. People work from home. People should leave their career to do jobs they want. If our taxes weren't so high, they'd work even less. What is he talking about? Peasants used to just live. They had to, half the time they were working for the king, the other half the time they were working to feed their families. There's this idyllic idea that, like, peasants used to only work 4 days a week. Peasants were, the average life expectancy was like 30. What are you talking about?
So we disagree with Adorno over here.
It's fantasy. It's an utter fantasy. The problem is they've never lived. What is the meme? The famous 4-part meme. Hard times make strong men. Strong men make good times. Good times make weak men. Weak men make bad times. We are in the good times make weak men period, right? Where you have people like this who have an Overton window who think that working a 9 to 5 is being a slave on a galley. He thinks that he's rowing a longship, along the shores of Norway in the 11th century. Bro, what are you talking about? The fact that he has the time to write crap like this means that he's not working hard enough. In fact, he might be a good sales pitch for making people work harder. They work harder, they wouldn't have bad ideas like this. They'd be busy.
So we're not Adorno fans over here.
No, I guess not.
So why? So you think that people under the capitalist system still have enough time to read and consume art and do all of these things?
Separate. Capitalism creates the best living conditions humanly imaginable. It's human nature, and it's nature because it's competitive, but without any of the brutality. No one's getting eaten. Large people like myself are not eating smaller people on the street. But other than that, it's a state of nature. It's the most efficient use of human resources.
But haven't you often heard the complaint that a lot of people don't read because they're so tired and overworked from their jobs that then they come home and then they want to do something else and
fantasy that the working class was not reading Chaucer again or whoever in literature. Yeah, that was always literature was the love of the aristocrats. We just only saw that looking back. You think this is fantasy. What you think the average tenement worker in London in 1830 was reading a manuscript? I got news, sister. He couldn't read at all. Right? They were watching bear fighting. Or like seeing how many rats a terrier could kill in 10 minutes. Like these are the kind of activities they were doing. Now, if you want to talk about the availability of depressing or rote or stultifying entertainment, we could do that. I would argue that video game play has created sort of an interesting ability for people that it stunts their social development, but it does teach analytical skills. But if you want to talk about terrible Hollywood movies, I got news for you. That may be the only industry more liberal than academia.
Okay. Well, so based on what we're saying here, you don't like Adorno, and you also think that people are not reading less because they're overworked from capitalism. Why do you think people are reading less, and why do you think people don't really read anymore as much as they used to?
Technology and the prevalence of entertainment. I mean, I'll give myself as an example. I grew up playing video games and reading. Obviously, my esoteric gathering of knowledge did not come from playing Warcraft, right? But now, to be entertained, I'm playing a video game with my second screen playing a YouTube video about something. Like the level of ADD, as the threshold of what it takes to make us excited. I mean, I hate to say it, it's the same effect that pornography has in people's sex lives is probably the effect that ample entertainment is having on reading something like literature, which has a deeper, you've read Faust, I'm sure, knowing you.
I made a video about Faust recently.
I'm sorry I asked. I should have known better. So the idea of Faust, right, is that the devil's gifts are gifts up front, and then you pay for it later, right? And God's gifts, you have to work for them, but at the end, you receive redemption, right? So literature is a lot of work, and it's a lot of reading, but at the end, you have an epiphany. Whereas this work, I hate to say it, it's like the devil, all this stuff is like the devil's playground, right? It's just immediate gratification, but at the end, you just want more. You've learned nothing. You haven't been enlightened. You've just had your senses titillated, like being electrocuted. You want more, you want more, you want more. And, well, but only a very strong-willed person will choose that kind of entertainment, and particularly when there's no one to discuss it with, or when the people you discuss it with are like looking at it from the prism of, Marxism or something. Not really not that alluring, right? Not that alluring.
Sure. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that a vast majority of my audience does skew politically left. Why do you think that liberals nowadays read more than conservatives do?
Do they?
Well,
because it sounds to me, my friend, like you've made a little bit of a equals B, C equals B equals C, so A equals C type of situation, right? What are they reading? I bet they're reading more like, the Jacobin.com, but I doubt that they're reading more Wall Street Journal. I doubt that they're reading more history. How about history? I talked to people, I became famous, apparently, or I shouldn't say famous, for discussing the history of the Mideast in a very oversimplified way, and people were like, whoa, damn, I didn't know that. Like, people don't know that, right?
Sure.
So,
sure. What about like literature?
I don't know I can't say that it's fair for us to say that they read more literature, right? Because when you think of literature, talking about older literature, right? Do you think that they, them, with a Palestinian keffiyeh wrapped around his head, upon which they'd be hanged if they were in Palestine, by the way. But do you think they are reading the literature that you so much venerate?
I've talked to quite a few people since starting this whole Pens and Poison venture who we've talked a lot about, the sort of literature that I venerate, as you so put it. And they've been very left-leaning. So I have actually talked to several leftists and no conservatives so far who have at least proclaimed it. Maybe the leftists are just a little bit more open.
Well, they're in the same industry. People might be reading it. I mean, the question is, where would they read it, right? Like, for them to read something like that would probably be either in a class or maybe their parents recommended it, something like that. You have to remember, we're looking at what I imagine is a somewhat small sample size, particularly outside of academia.
Sure. So you don't think that conservatives are necessarily reading less than the liberal counterparts?
I mean, based on some of the things I've talked about with certain liberal people, I don't know what they're reading. So I don't know if that's true. I mean, are they watching news? Maybe. They're certainly reading, if you look at certain industries, for instance, if they're in finance, conservative skewing thing, right? They're reading quite a bit. They're just reading like studies in their field. They're not reading this. In fact, I would argue that what was it, Adorno? He argued people don't have enough time to read. It looks like people on the left have more free time if they're able to read that, right?
You kind of look like Adorno. You should look him up.
I don't know if that's going to be a compliment. I'm concerned.
Yeah. He has the same look going as Yan Margolin. Just saying.
Well, we're going to give me a second. This better not be something I'm disappointed with. What's his first name?
Theodor Adorno.
This podcast is over if I don't like what he looks like. Yeah, but no, his head. Yeah, but look at his body. His shoulders are a third of the size of mine.
Yeah, but
I
his
don't think
head kind
I
of
don't
looks
think
like yours.
Marxists work out. That's not really a thing. You know? Wasn't there some article by someone where like, are you going to the gym? You might be a right winger.
Um, sure. I, I don't know.
He looks
Possible.
perpetually startled.
Yeah, he's a little like, he's kind of mousy.
But I would
You
say
can,
almost more like a confused owl of some sort.
sure.
Giant eyes bulging out
But
of his head.
he has your like head shape.
Sort of. Actually, I hate to say it, mine's probably bigger.
Anyway, um, but I do think on average conservatives read less of the sort of literature that I
Okay,
enjoy
that's okay.
than liberals.
If you wanted to say, you said read broadly. This
Sure. So, okay, so
probably.
why is that? Why is that? No, we talked about the literature that I venerate, which I don't think is inherently liberal
Not at
or
all.
conservative or
Not
whatnot.
at all. Not at all.
So,
No.
so why do you think conservatives don't read it?
I don't know if a lot of people, I hate to say it, I'm not sure if a lot of people read it outside of academia in the first place, right? So much to read. And the internet, right? There's so much to read. Men are reading Tom Clancy, chicks are reading 50 Shades of Grey. Who's reading, Lord Byron?
Except
Let's,
me, apparently. Well, as I found out since I've started this thing, a lot of people, like apparently 17,000 people, or maybe they just followed me for the
or at
Taylor
least are
Swift video.
interested. Or at least are interested enough in something like this, which is good.
Sure. Which is more than you expected.
Well,
Okay.
it's a very large country. Let's be very fair here. It is a
That's
very
true, but
large.
it's only
Now,
been
granted,
like a month. It's only been a month that I've been
that's
doing
true.
this.
That's true. You have not
So
reached
in a
such a
month, I
wide.
found 17,000 human beings who are interested in me talking about literature.
That's something.
So, and the vast majority of them seem to be liberal leaning,
I
for
would think
better
so.
or for worse.
No, I would think so.
So,
I think conservative people at this point. You have to remember, so a lot of these books probably were more interesting from a contemporary perspective, closer to when they were written. There's so
I
little.
so I think what makes them timeless is the fact that we still read them. And there are actually a lot of books, let's say Victorian era books. There were so many books produced in the Victorian era. We only remember like 3 or 4 Victorian authors because
Dracula, Frankenstein. What else we got? What are the books you are referring to, actually? Like, give me five,
so
so we can
okay,
have like a pillar.
so there's Charles Dickens, so he has a lot of books. So Tale of Two Cities, we
Sure.
read a lot. George Eliot, if you know who that is,
Familiar, but I don't know if
is
I've
a
name
woman.
work.
Middlemarch, and you're actually gonna like this. She wrote a book called Daniel Deronda, and it was considered one of the first kind of Zionist
No.
books. She was not Jewish, but she actually supported the Zionist movement, and
Back
she
then
wrote,
we were minorities. Back then we were cool to the liberals.
yeah.
Now we're not cool.
So she, yeah. Well, she was actually a big supporter of the Zionist movement. Well, which was
So was Mark Twain, I believe, or at least he supported the Jewish people. I know that
yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, so George Eliot, so she wrote a book called Daniel Deronda, which is still widely read. It's about Jewish kid and this woman who falls in love with a Jewish kid, and then, that's bad.
A forbidden love, I get it.
So these books, I think, are still very much with us today, and people still read them, and they're very relevant. There are other books that have more or less fallen away. So I can't even name them because I haven't read them, but I know.
Well, I think of Victorian literature, that era, I'm thinking of Dracula. I'm thinking of Frankenstein, right? Those are two very significant books, particularly Frankenstein.
Sure. Well, Frankenstein was a little bit earlier. Romantics.
Yeah, like more Lord Byron era, right? Like that.
Yeah,
Weren't they all friends?
that was a romantic. What's up?
Weren't they all friends?
Yes, so they all actually went. I forget, they were camping or something. I was gonna make a video about this at some point. They were camping or something like that. They went up to a mountain and they all had like a horror story contest, and Mary Shelley was there, and Percy Shelley was there.
He invented horror.
Yeah, so they basically, on the same day, Frankenstein was born, and then it wasn't actually Dracula, so Bram Stoker was not there. But the precursor, the work that inspired Dracula, there was another work about a vampire that was born on that.
Interesting. Interesting. When I think of literature, would you consider H.P. Lovecraft to be literature?
Yeah, I have actually, my editor really likes H.P. Lovecraft.
I'm a huge H.P. Lovecraft guy. Do not, under any circumstances, look up the name of H.P. Lovecraft's cat. It wasn't good. Not
Okay.
certainly not acceptable today. To
I
put
will
it
look it
mildly.
up. Okay.
To
All
put it
right.
mildly.
Um,
But he had some great stories. That I'd recommend. I actually think reading that, like, what I like about that kind of literature is it makes people's vocabulary richer.
most literature makes people's vocabulary richer. Most
Lovecraft
actual literature.
really enjoyed esoteric word use. He was an esoteric guy, put
Yeah.
mildly.
Yeah.
Well, he was a weird guy because he also he married a Jew but hated Jews. He loved like British and English American like continental aristocracy, but he was a nobody. So
Yeah.
he wasn't welcome in the society that he thought was so fantastic.
Yeah.
There's that.
There's that. So why do you think we still read these books, or why are they still with us today?
Well, why wouldn't I mean to abandon history is to destroy your past. These are phenomenal works. They should absolutely be read. I would of course wonder how many of the readers reading them are reading them through a broken prism of some these visions you've said, because reading, for instance, reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is great from a Christian or Judaic perspective because it's a man playing God, right? And the horror that elapses that comes from that. If you're an atheist, that book hits different. Hits
Well,
less.
Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley were actually big progressives, even what we would
that
call
era.
progressive, probably for our time. So Percy Shelley was a socialist and a vegetarian.
Back then, what era? Okay, so this is pre-Marxism, then it must be, right?
This is this is I guess Percy Shelley was a romantic poet, so it was actually even pre-Victorian. So they were big leftists. And do you know who Mary Shelley's mom was?
No.
Mary Wollstonecraft.
Sounds familiar.
You know,
Wasn't
Mary
that a
Wollstonecraft?
feminist writer or something, right?
Yes. So she's kind of considered the first feminist writer, actually. So this was actually a very
I was going to say
family.
Joan of Arc could maybe be considered the first feminist, but yeah.
Well,
Who
the
cares
first
about fighting
feminist,
a war? Let's write a book.
the first feminist kind of writer who put forth the feminist treatise. So that was a very progressive family. So even historically,
Well, and they were writers, right? But the book
Right.
was tailored to. But you see what I'm saying? It was perceived today. We're inundated with so much stuff about zombies and whatnot. But the thought of creating this powerful being that has no cortex of understanding because he wasn't born, and the doctor's hubris. I think it. Well, I guess if you're a smart atheist, you could look at it and say, well, maybe I should rethink just how much power I think I should have. Right? It's sort of like what is that society? It's like an atheistic, humanistic society that rethinks morality absent atheism. So it's saying we need morality even though we're atheists. I don't know what it is. It's on the west side of the park.
what
There's a society of atheistic morality.
today?
Because atheism obviously can lead to no, since you don't believe in anything, you
Sure.
can believe in anything you want, right?
Atheistic.
Somebody's fly off the deep end.
I wouldn't be able to tell you.
You're too busy reading literature.
I am too busy reading literature. But
Literature
I
and
can
metaphor.
talk about other things. But we're talking about literature here.
We are. Okay. I mean, I don't know if I answered your question. I just think, I hate to say it, I think it's still a somewhat small sample size. Many people probably read these things in high school. Depends what high school
Because they
went
were
to.
forced to.
Oh, certainly. I went to private school. I was forced to. Didn't mean I didn't enjoy it. Involuntary friendship is the best kind of friendship, some will say. There's lots of fun and there's no escape. Yeah.
But, okay, I guess I'm making the observation from just my audiences and people I've met in the literary world. But I think that conservatives on average read less. And you can actually...
literature.
Less literature.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'd probably agree. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I guess then the question is, why is that?
Well, first of all, okay, so if you really want to get really into it, I bet the ethno-religious demographics, if you chop it up, I bet the ones reading the most are probably going to be white women, if I would imagine. If I were to guess this kind of stuff, I could be wrong, but if they are...
not literature. I think that probably...
This is where the segment really takes a turn. At the
Probably.
hour mark, we reach eugenics. Here we go.
Oh boy.
Oh boy.
No
Oh
eugenics
boy.
on this channel, just saying.
Was that?
I said no eugenics on this channel.
Obviously. I think on any channel.
Um,
That didn't work out.
Probably women and gay men.
I was just saying.
I don't want to throw racial assignations out there either.
Well, the reason I say is because those are so. Most women, most young women, skew liberal. White women become much less liberal when they get married. So if we're looking at college age and post-college age readers, you're talking about demographics that skew more left to begin with. So it becomes a self-selection size, where,
Sure.
if the woman, if especially if women are pursuing more, sort of not indulgent, but more like feminine careers like marketing versus the dude who's working like waking up at 7 because he's working at a bank, if that's the breakdown we're talking about, he's probably going to Brother Jimmy's afterwards. He's probably not reading Chaucer. Right? Like, let's be real. He's also a lot of the more common entertainment forms that would be replacement of reading are more male skewed, namely sports. Because there's no form of entertainment I can think of, even Netflix included, that covers as much ground for the female demographic as sports does for men.
So you think women are reading instead of watching sports?
Which is a good call, by the way. They're right on that front.
Yeah, I mean,
I agree.
Yeah.
Men should read more, but blood and what did the Romans say? Give them bread and give them blood, right?
So how can we get conservatives to read then? If you think they should.
I think they should. No, I think they should. Well, first you remind them that it'll improve their vocabulary and probably make girls like them more. Not that I think girls like long words all that much necessarily, but setting that aside, you do. But you're not usual. Plus, I don't know if your boyfriend speaks very much at all. Second of all, I think the way to do it is to remind them that they don't need to do it in the context of like feminist studies. They don't need to do it through a lens of feminist studies, and they can do it on their own time. And then go. Also, the great thing about the internet. See, the one thing is though, like, where would you discuss it? These kinds of books are only great when you have someone to discuss them with, right? So where are you discussing it? On Reddit? Reddit's the most liberal.
On my YouTube channel.
On your YouTube channel. But generally speaking, right, where are you going to discuss it? Reddit is as far left as 4chan is far right. You can't discuss it there.
I'm creating a space with the Pens and Poison YouTube channel to foster open dialogue between liberals and conservatives on literature.
I think it's a good idea. I think you should do like a book club thing. Every 2 weeks, assign a book. Presume people are working or working hard in school, like they can't read, a 300-page dense novel with long words in like a week, and then have a discussion.
You're right. This is how we bridge the problem that's happening in America with the whole left-right divide. We bring them together through Liza's book club.
Sure.
Done.
That'll work.
Yeah.
That will heal what amounts to the greatest divide since maybe like almost pre-Civil War. Sure. Let's do it.
We'll do it. We'll see. Literature will heal everything, as always.
Has it ever? I'm trying to think. It's
never. Literature has it.
Well, but most people couldn't read for large swaths of history, so it's hard to. We're kind of treading new ground here. But listen, a few more years of TikTok, they won't be able to read again. We'll be right back to where we started about literacy.
I'm creating a space where people are going to be able to read literature and discuss it, and they won't have to worry about their liberal or conservative viewpoints, and they will just talk about the books, and then everyone will be happy.
That sounds wonderful. That sounds
It is wonderful.
Is that your segue for the end?
Yes. We have reached the end of the episode.
Survived, I think is the word you're looking for.
We survived. We survived episode 1 of the Pens and Poison podcast. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed Jan's hot takes. We'll be back for more very soon as I identify my next victim. And thank you all again.
I'm a large target, so I'm easy to find. It's true.
That's true. Subscribe. Follow me on Instagram. I'll link it somewhere here. Thank you guys so much, and have a good night.